The lives of those with disabilities in countries like Ghana, Russia, and India are marred by challenges and superstitions. Well, Shantha Rau Barriga is hoping to change that. She's the Director of Disability Rights for Human Rights Watch. Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, Piya.
Okay, we're going to go through various countries as our conversation goes on, but I just want to put up some facts to start off with. So let's take a look at these. So there are more than 1 billion people, 15% of the global population worldwide, who live with a disability. 120 to 150 million children with disabilities under the age of 18 worldwide. When you hear those numbers, what goes through your mind?
Well, despite the fact that they're a very significant population, what we've seen in so many countries is how they're neglected, how people with disabilities are abused, and how they're actually quite invisible in many countries. They're hidden in their homes, or they're hidden in institutions, locked up for years, and that's why we're doing what we're doing at Human Rights Watch and with many other organizations that we work with.
Okay, let's talk about this word disability.
Okay.
Let's just define it. We're talking about physical disability, mental illness?
Exactly. So disability includes a range of conditions. So people with physical disabilities is quite clear. People with sensory disabilities who might be deaf or blind, people with intellectual disabilities, for example, Down syndrome or some forms of cerebral palsy. And then what the disability community prefers the term psychosocial disability or mental illness or mental health conditions. These are things like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder. And what's happened in the last, let's say, 10 years or so is that the concept of disability has really changed. It was often seen from a very medical approach. You're in a wheelchair, I'm going to fix you, I'm going to cure you, or you have a mental health condition, and this is how we're going to fix you and make you all better. But now the concept of disability is really considered a person's impairment together with the environment, the communication barriers, the environmental barriers, the attitudinal barriers that they experience, and that's what's disabling. It's no longer that a person's in a wheelchair, it's the fact that there's no ramp into the building, which prohibits them from actually going to the same restaurants that you or I might go to. Okay,
let's look at a number of countries. I think these ones are probably ones that have particularly ghastly abuses. Although I would probably suggest to you, I want to hear your thoughts on this, that we all have work to do no matter what country we live in when it comes to these issues.
Yes, we work, whether it's developing countries, we do work in the United States and in North America and in Europe, because it is true. I mean, no matter where people with disabilities are living, they struggle. They really are struggling to have the same rights, and they're often thought of as inhuman or even as animals.
Okay, so let's start with Central African Republic, country that's been in crisis for a number of years. When you look at the car, what obstacles do people with disabilities face who are in conflict zones?
Well, I'll tell you the story of a young girl named Hamamatu, whom we interviewed. She's about 13 years old, and she had polio. And when the gunshots were fired in her village, part of her family fled, but her brother came back and said, "I'm going to carry you on my back, even though you can't walk to escape. I'm going to carry you." And he carried Hamamatu as far as he could until at some point she says to him, "You are so exhausted and you're the one being targeted in this violence, so you save yourself and I'll be okay." And he put her under a tree where she was waiting for somebody to come back. And he said, "If I don't come back, it means that I'm dead." And she knew that reality, and she was waiting, and at some point the rebel fighters came and they saw her and they said to her, "Look, we found an animal, let's finish it off." And fortunately, someone within the group said, "She's a girl, let's spare her," and she actually was spared her life. And someone did find her then another week later and took her to a Catholic mission where she finally got food and water and shelter and is actually going to school now. But that's the kind of attitudes that we see, whether in conflict zones or not. But here you have a desperate situation where people are really unable to flee, and if they do escape, they're probably not have access to water, to food, and to other basic services.
And as Human Rights Watch raises awareness about these issues in countries like Central African Republic, how have aid agencies responded?
Well, what we've seen in Central African Republic is really quite exciting. When we went there in January and we met with aid agencies, they shared that they didn't actually think too much about how to integrate people with disabilities because it was a crisis and it was overwhelming, and we understand, of course, there are so many competing priorities. But when, again, you look back at the numbers and it's a significant percentage of the population, I mean, we would argue that in places that are developing countries as well as conflict, the 15% is actually much higher in those kind of settings. And the aid agencies said, please give us the evidence, give us some recommendations, and we really want to do more. And we should be doing more to make sure that our assistance reaches all people in the conflict. And so the UN Security Council in April of this year adopted a new resolution renewing the peacekeeping mandate and now requires the UN to monitor, report, and protect abuses against people with disabilities. So there'll actually be more evidence, there's going to be more information about the situations, the challenges that they experience, and that means that will translate into more action from the entire humanitarian response.
Okay, so some changes being made, progress being made. I want to talk about another country which is much more stable, Ghana. How would you characterize the state of disability rights in Ghana?
Well, we looked at abuses against people with mental health conditions in Ghana back in 2012. And I tell you, if I didn't see it myself, I wouldn't believe what I saw, because we saw overcrowded psychiatric hospitals where hundreds of men were lying in a room like sardines, without any shelter, with barely any food, forcibly given the little medication that was available. And then we also visited what are called prayer camps. These are spiritual healing centers where often people go because they might have had a loss of a loved one, or they might have lost their job, or they need some place to go to pray, to find some spiritual healing. But in many of these camps, there are people with mental health conditions who are locked up in chains, who are not given any food, who are not given any water, who are, if anything, given some herbal concoctions that the head of these camps deems will help them recover. And it comes from this belief that they are possessed by demons, that the disability, that the mental health condition is a curse. And to rid them of this curse, they should basically starve it out of them. And you know, I met girls as young as 5 who were put in these camps. I met a man who was there for 5 years, chained to the same tree, under the sun.
For 5 years?
For 5 years.
Wow. And
so it's really, you know, the days that we went on that mission to Ghana, I mean, were some of the hardest that we documented.
I mean, how does this happen? Ghana's stable. It's got one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. How doesn't that kind of progress translate into respect for people with disabilities? People are chained up for 5 years. It is hideous, and it sounds like something that happened, you know, centuries ago.
It's true. Well, that's the problem, and Ghana's not an isolated case. This phenomenon of chaining, of shackling people, particularly those with mental health conditions, happens in many countries. We're actually documenting this very issue in Indonesia. We are documented it in Somaliland, in East Africa. We know of some cases in a number of other countries. But I think again, it's this belief that of the superstition of the fact that disability, you know, cannot be something that you know, it's related to evil spirits.
They don't have a concept of mental illness.
They don't. They really don't have an understanding of that they're human beings, and that's why they're put in chains. But interestingly, I was just in Accra recently, and things are changing there too, and I'm really excited about that. And we're working with the mental health authority. We're working with the chief psychiatrist, and you know, I was at this workshop, and he said that human rights abuses are things we can't stand for, and they want to actually really de-chain those people in the prayer camps and train the heads of these camps to understand how to treat people humanely, and that they should get mental health services. And and do that on a voluntary basis instead of being forced into these camps. And so there is beginning a shift. It's going to take some time because it's about really changing attitudes. And we're working in Ghana with local disabled persons organizations and mental health advocates, as we do in every country that we work on this issue, because we really honor this principle of nothing about us without us. This idea that people with disabilities should be speaking up for themselves, and we just try to amplify that voice. And in Ghana, we worked with some people who have mental health conditions who are productive members of society. They're working, they're moms, they're dads, they're part of the church community. And so it's not something to be feared. It's not something that is the other. It's actually, 1 in 4 people, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, has a mental health condition.
Well, and I understand, and I think everyone understands that cultural traditions that are, they're hard to break down culturally. Like, it's not that it's just like people that are uneducated stuff that believe it, but cultural traditions, old beliefs, are hard to break down, especially when they come attached with things like stigma in many countries. Okay, so what's the government in Ghana doing? Because you talked about disability rights groups and the work that HRW is doing. What's the government of Ghana doing?
Well, the Ministry of Health is really beginning to ramp up its efforts. So it's planning to actually ban chaining in the country, from what we were told recently. And they're also trying to really ramp up their community-based, more local mental health services. And it's something that we've been putting a lot of pressure on together with local groups. Okay.
How do you go? I should have asked this a second ago, but how do you go about changing those cultural superstitions, those cultural disbeliefs, especially because you're from the outside, you're an outsider coming in. That can be dangerous kind of position to be in, because people are like, well, don't bring your outside beliefs in.
Absolutely.
How do you go about changing these cultural beliefs?
Well, that's why it's key for us to work with local partners, because they're often the better messenger for some of things than we are. We're also working with groups like UNICEF and UN agencies who have communication tools and outreach that they can also help work with us to share the message. Even the World Health Organization, who's really been interested in working more on shackling. And it's, I think, the positive images that we put out in the media, showing people with disabilities who can be independent. In fact, in Croatia, we did some work in the past few years, and we launched a video that showed people with disabilities, both intellectual and those with mental health conditions, who are living in the community on their own, and how there's been no repercussions. There's not really anything to worry about or anything to fear. And what it really boils down to is that people with disabilities or certain disabilities might need some support in making decisions. You or I might need support in making a financial decision, like buying a house. And they might need support in going to the grocery store and figuring out, which box is the better deal. But at the end of the day, it's just a matter of respecting that people might need different levels of support, but we're all really equal human beings.
Okay. I have to ask, I want to, because I know you do work in here, but I want to talk to you about India. It's a country that I've been to many times visiting, and been appalled sometimes at the treatment of people with disabilities. It is also, like Ghana, a country that is changing. We talk about India booming, the middle class is growing, progress is happening. Just explain to us how people with disabilities are looked upon in India and treated for the most part. Well, I know it's a diverse country, so.
It is, but it is quite shocking. When I was in India over the past couple of years, we documented abuses against women in mental health institutions and in other residential institutions. And it still happens that they're hidden in their homes. It still happens that they're put on a train for hours to the nearest big mental health hospital, and then they come out of the train station and they don't even know where they are, and are picked up by the police and are taken to these hospitals. People with disabilities are a shame in many countries, including India, and it's it was a tough trip for me. And what we documented in the institutions and in the mental hospitals is that they don't have a right to say anything about their lives. Their word is not taken with any kind of value. So once they're locked up in these places, they're basically there to die. And that's what staff told us. And so the family members don't come to visit them. They give false information so that they can't be contacted. And we met girls and women who were subjected to a range of abuses, physical abuse, chemical restraints, physical restraints. And you know, this is a place where I think they're just dumped. And that's what many people said to us while we were in India. And
what's a chemical restraint?
You know, being forcibly drugged and basically sedated for long periods of time without any kind of say in whether that treatment is useful for you or something that you'd even consider.
All right, so you talk about shame and ostracized. People are ostracized in India if you have a family member that has a disability. The shame is not only for that individual, it reflects on the family.
Of course.
How do you go in a country that's diverse, that is so overpopulated, how do you go, what's being done there to make things better?
Well, I think in India, what we found after we released our report is a lot of openness in the government, particularly in the Ministry of Women. And they actually announced that they will be doing their first ever survey on women in mental health institutions across the country. And what the problem is that there's very little evidence, there's very little data, little information about the situation of people with disabilities, particularly women, in these closed settings. And so hopefully by bringing out some of their stories, and giving them a voice, it'll help sort of shift the way people are portrayed.
It's a pretty bleak picture that you're painting. Rather, I do want to talk about some of the successes or progress that's being made. So let's talk about Russia. Russia has made progress in how it treats people with disabilities. What's been going on in Russia?
Well, they're on the road to progress. What we documented over the last 2 years, children living in orphanages in Russia. And again, you know, it's interesting as I'm talking about India, I'm talking about Ghana, I'm talking about Russia, and I'm saying the same. You know, they're abused, they're neglected, and in some cases, the children are tied up to their beds, are even, you know, taken to the psychiatric hospital as a form of punishment for small infractions like running in the hallways and so on in these orphanages. But what we documented was, which was particularly striking to me, I'm a mother myself, and is that 95% of these kids in institutions and these orphanages have a living parent. And about 1/3 of them who live in these orphanages are kids with disabilities. And so when you have a child with a disability in Russia, you're coached by the doctor to give that child up. You're told that that child will never talk to you, will never walk, will never say I love you. Really, this child will not give back to you, and you will not be able to take care of this child on your own. And so the best thing to do is for you to give your child to the state, to the state orphanages. And that's what parents do time and again because of the pressure right after having a child and thinking that they wouldn't be able to provide the right support and care for that child. And then we met cases of mothers who said, you know what, I want to bring my child home, and I know that I can take better care of this child, because in these institutions, we went to one of them where they have rows and rows of cribs. They're called lying down rooms. And children who are deemed to not be able to walk or not be able to talk are put in these rooms. And they basically lie there all day and all night.
Yeah, we were scrolling through some of the photos from an orphanage in Northwest Russia.
In one of the pictures my colleague took, it's a young boy, I don't know if you can put it on the screen, who's in a diaper, and he's in a crib, and she thought he was about...
there we go, there's that photo.
This is a 14-year-old girl, believe it or not.
That's a 14-year-old girl?
Yes. And the previous picture, I think, with the two kids in the crib side by side, the one on the left she picked up, and she held this boy in her arms, and she thought he was about 2 or 3 years old. And she asked the staff member, you know, how old is he, you know, when did he come here, what kind of condition does he have? And she's holding him, and the staff member says, well, he's 18 years old.
18 in that crib?
In that crib. And he has Down syndrome, and starts telling his story. And it was really shocking because we showed these photographs to pediatricians who told us that these kids can develop much more if they were in a more stimulating environment, if they were given proper nutrition, if they were given any kind of education, any kind of rehabilitation. But you saw yourself in the pictures, you know, what happens to them, and then that boy's actually en route to an adult institution because he's 18 and he would now be shipped off somewhere else where he'll basically live the rest of his life.
You know, I said Russia's making some progress.
Sorry.
Some progress, and there we go.
Yeah.
But they are making progress.
They are. You know, they have really taken our report seriously. And
why do you think this government is taking this issue seriously?
I think for a number of reasons. I think we found that disability rights is something that governments are open to addressing. There are some more controversial rights issues that are more difficult, and a lot of the work that Human Rights Watch does is documenting, you know, prisons and police abuse and other forms of abuse. So this issue, I think, is something where governments feel, okay, we want to do the right thing, and it'll look good for us to do the right thing. And so I think there's been actually a lot of openness in countries for where we haven't seen so much traction on some other issues that we work on. And so the Russian government has taken the report seriously by distributing it to all of the institutions and agencies that work with kids in orphanages. And they're trying to follow up on the recommendations. And my colleague has been very actively engaged with the Russian government to see that through.
All right, we want to talk about one more country. I want you to set, we're going to play a little tape. I want you to set this up. This is Kenya,
yes.
A school for the deaf. So set this up for us a bit.
So we wanted to highlight an issue that is really you know, off the radar, which is about access to education in sign language for deaf children. And we had an amazing colleague join us who was deaf, and so she helped us put together this video that we shot in Kenya that shows the importance of learning sign language for deaf children as a way of learning and communicating.
Okay, let's take a look at that, and we'll
Sure.
talk a little bit after that.
My name? Good. Yours? Yeah, and good. My name? Good. Yours? Your name? You are not Anne. My name? Yours. What is her name? Yeah, beautiful. She's very good in taking in the sign language. It's very important to her because she can now be communicating to other people. While she was at home, there was no sign language being taught there. Are you happy? Yeah, happy. True.
It's amazing what the teacher there said. These kids were at home. They had no way to communicate with their parents, with their families, with their broader community. It speaks to the need for education in
Absolutely,
this issue.
and education is the key, I think, for so much of the rights of people with disabilities. You know, if they're not integrated in the schools, it means that they're not getting an education. It means that other children are not understanding the diversity of the humanity. And I think that that's just as equally as important, that for the longer term, if kids with disabilities aren't going to the same schools and integrated in the community with other kids, then they'll continue to be isolated down the line. They'll continue to be bullied or discriminated. And for the other kids to learn about just how people are different in different ways, I think it's a really important lesson to learn.
We have to round out our conversation, but I want you to leave us with it. I mean, where do you look in the world and say, yeah, that country's doing well when it comes to the rights of the disabled and improving lives for everyone?
I think there are some countries that are doing good things, but I wouldn't say, you know, there's a country that's a model on disability rights. I mean, disability rights has evolved, as I said, and it's really, there's a long way to go. And there are some countries that are really making a very strong commitment to that. I mean, even here in Canada, I think there's really been a lot of progress. There's more integration of people and children with disabilities, as I said, in schools, and which I think is key. But there's still a long way to go here too. But it's great there's so many wonderful advocates here in Canada that we partner with and who are really pushing that agenda forward.
Thank you for sharing these stories. It's disturbing as are. It's good to talk about this stuff. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Piya.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.